The wind came like a question that night, a low, relentless asking that scraped the shutters and filled the hollows of the old mill with sound. Ada Mallory stood at her kitchen window, hands around a cup gone cold, and listened to it. The farm had been quieter since Daniel died the year before, quiet in a way that pressed on her chest and kept her from remembering what it was like to fill the house with ordinary noise. The stove was only embers, the kettle long gone to rust, and the photograph on the mantel had the same polite, accusing smile it had always worn. She touched the frame as if she might shore the face from slipping away. Outside, the snow began like ash, then moved into full weight, layering everything in a pale, soft denial. It muffled the world the way grief muffled days. It covered tracks and conversations and the careless marks of horses on the road. Ada drew her shawl tighter, put the cup down, and went to bed with her boots on. There was comfort in being ready to leave, even if there was nowhere she planned to go. She hadn't meant to ride out at all. The farmer down the road, old Harlan, had sent a boy to ask if she could spare a lantern. The boy's feet were numb, and he had the wink of frost near his eyebrows. The farm hand at Harlan's had taken ill, and the lantern at the barn had blown out. Ada wrapped her coat, found the lantern, and took the road by the creek. The same creek that had always carried off bits of town in spring and kept secrets at its bends. The lantern was small but a good light. She held it low and walked purposeful steps, the hem of her skirt collecting snow, boots leaving a single line that the wind tried to erase. The mill creaked like an old man's sigh when she passed. The sluice gate had frozen half open, and the wheel clattered beneath a blanket of ice, sounding like a machine remembering its duty. Ada called for the boy and Harlan, and only the river answered. The night seemed to conspire to keep people indoors, to remind them of the precariousness of life with the cold pressing in. It was then she saw the ruin at the edge of the knoll, the remains of what had been the Haversham outbuilding, half a year ago reduced to char and splinter when lightning struck an old beam. Snow had softened the edges, made the jagged into something gentler. A basket lay half buried against a fallen beam, simple willow woven in a pattern of care. Ada stopped a foot away, the lantern throwing a circle of warm light over the rim. For a moment she thought someone had left provisions, a note, something for the animals. Then she heard the small, shattering sound of a cry so thin it was almost a memory. She knew the sound with an instinct that was more than knowledge. It split her like a gale splits a tree. The basket was shallow, and within lay a bundle wrapped in a faded shawl. Someone had stitched a tiny letter into the cloth. A careful M, or maybe an H, the thread dull with age. The bundle moved. Ada bent and took it up with hands that remembered holding a boy's small head decades before, hands that had been accustomed to threshing and feeding and mending, to the work that keeps a house speaking. The baby was smaller than what Ada had expected, thinner, with skin that held a pale blue like the inside of a winter sky. Its breath came small and fast, more like the flutter of a bird than the steady inhale of a child. The eyes were closed, nails like the points of tiny moons. She wrapped it inside her shawl, felt the little shoulders tremble against her chest. The lantern light trembled. The wind wanted to take the moment away. Ada carried the child back by steps that seemed both too quick and too careful. The path home was a strip of dark between white fields. Sometimes the snow would give and her foot would drop into a hollow, but she kept the baby sheltered, the shawl pressed to her breast. The house greeted them with a sigh of colder air, a place that still held Daniel's scent like a shadow. She set the basket by the stove, went through movements that were almost ritual. Build a fire from the dry wood stacked near the doorway, boil water in a pot that had not seen use for months, find clothes that could be washed and warmed. Her fingers moved as if remembering, but slower, thinned by long nights spent alone. The baby woke and cried in a way that made something inside Ada splinter. It was a thin, urgent sound, hunger wrapped in fear. She mixed milk as Daniel had once instructed his sister when she had a babe, though the instructions were years old and printed in a book she could no longer name. The baby drank with need that was all hunger and survival, clinging to the bottle like a log to a riverbank. Ada watched the way its small knuckles fisted around the glass, the way its brow smoothed as if the world made sense again, for a moment, in the small physics of feeding. Sleep came in the gray hours, when the house felt like it might remember happier days for a breaking heartbeat. Ada dozed, the baby warm in the crook of her arm. She woke to the sound of the bell at the town boundary. Mrs. Collins' old brass, still rung when the post came through, and found that the child had curled into her, as if home had always been this cabin. By dawn, news had done what news always does in a small place and gathered itself around facts. The church knocker had tapped on many doors, and people stood in the fresh day with faces made small by the wind. Harlan's boy was there, rubbing his hands and peering with the blunt curiosity of the young. Folks came with bread, with knitted caps that were awkward but earnest, with questions that were thinly veiled opinions. Ada told them what she could. The baby had been found and was alive, and for the moment the rest, whose, why, where, could wait. A dozen hands fussed and fussed again. Women fuss better in such moments, as if the world could be ordered by clean cloth and warm soup. No one had seen who placed the child. The tracks were minimal, the snow erasing most traces. The mayor, a man in a heavy coat with a voice like a bell and less tenderness than a man should carry, asked why the child had been left and whether Ada meant to keep it. There were murmurs that rose like steam. A man named Perkins, who kept livestock and measures his worth in square acres, made a show of concern for propriety. "A widow," Perkins said, with a look at Ada and then at the baby. "A widowed woman raising a child in these parts is not how things are done." The words, meant to be procedural, hit hard enough to bruise. Ruth, who ran the boarding house and had a soft word for the lonely, came forward with a shawl and a determination that matched the storm. "She's a child," she said plainly. "No one abandons babies for sport. She needs care. Ada's earned the right to make that call." She crowded near Ada and the baby as if her presence translated into moral armor. The crowd split into some who nodded and some who averted their eyes. Small towns know how to stand with someone and how to stand aloof, sometimes with the same face. The shawl revealed a tiny name stitched inside in thread that was not quite dry. Ada could not make the letters at first. She ran a thumb over the stitches until they became Mary, or maybe Mara, the mark soft with tears washed by the snow. Names are anchors. Ada might have offered the first name she could think of. Perhaps Lucy, perhaps Grace, and felt empty at the formality of naming anything in the face of such fragile life. Instead, someone in the crowd, an old seamstress who had once mended Ada's wedding dress, sighed and said without ceremony, "Call her Mercy then. If no one else will, Mercy fits the child." So Mercy she was, for the time being, until the wind shifted, or until a letter arrived, or until someone with money and law and a pedigree decided otherwise. Ada made a bed out of an old trunk, lined with the knitted blankets brought by neighbors, and placed the baby inside like something sacred and not yet completed. The neighbors brought food and offers of work and glances that said everything would change. Ada said nothing at first. The silence had been too familiar lately. She needed to let words build their own courage. Days unfurled and Mercy stubbornly lived, and that living made others do what living requires. Ada learned how to swaddle with a tenderness that surprised her, the folds precise, the hands that had once mended harnesses and hems now deft with infant cloth. Mercy, for all the fragility of her beginning, was fierce in small ways. A curl of fingers around Ada's ear, a practiced frown when sleep did not come quick enough, a recognition of Ada's voice that sent a soft answering gurgle through the child. Ada found a reason to rise before the sun, to attend to the small rituals of warming water and making porridge, to be present in ways she had not been since Daniel's illness stretched long and cruel. Yet the world beyond the cabin did not stop noticing. Eli Traynor arrived on a carriage polished and cold, a man whose name had weight because he had been building rail lines and buying land since before Ada's hair had begun to silver. He owned barns and influence and a stare that could make a man swallow his pride. His lawyer, a slim fellow with a face like folded paper, had a stack of papers that smelled faintly of city ink. They presented a claim without preamble. Mercy was the granddaughter of the Traynor household, they said. Her mother, A young woman called Anna Trainer, who had been run out of town for reasons that the more polite tongues would not speak, had been found ill in a wagon on the far road months prior. She had asked that her child be kept safe if she could not, and she had placed the child to Ada's hands by way of a plea. As Ada listened, her mouth felt dry, the way it does when a truth you have not been warned of is dropped like a stone. The paper smelled of finality. Ada read the name and found there was truth in it. Anna Trainer had been known, had been loved by some and shunned by others. Once she had courted a schoolmaster who held old books in his hands and poetry in his pockets, and the family had called him unworthy. Then he had been gone. A ride gone wrong, say the gossip, or an accident on the hill. Anna had been a bright, impulsive girl, the sort that spoke with spark, and could not understand the slow, careful life of the Trainer estate. That she had left her child in Mercy's path, whether by design or desperation, changed nothing of the ache it put inside Ada. Trainer's lawyer spoke of blood and legacy and the rights of heirs. "The law is plain," he said. "Custody of a minor defaults to their bloodline when such a party can be located. Mr. Trainer has both the means to provide and the standing to contest this matter." There was an offer. 2. Dressed in the warm cloth of benevolence. Trainer would provide funds for Mercy's upbringing, for schooling and comforts, if Ada would turn the child over to what he called her rightful guardianship. The town split itself along lines old and new. Some thought of Mercy as a ticket to better standing for Ada. Others felt the raw sting of a man who had placed himself above the small truths of care and replaced them with ledgers and titles. Ada's neighbors came with knitted shawls and a willingness to argue if it came to that. Ruth put her work down and stayed late into the night to teach Ada how to keep the milk from spoiling, to show her how to soothe a fever, to teach a woman who had been widowed that hands that had known other kinds of labor could learn these tasks. Ada's nights lengthened with fear. She had no desire for property disputes, no appetite for the formalities of law. She wanted Mercy to be safe. The claim, however, insisted one uncracking truth. Blood will always have its advocates in a town where names carry weight. Ada held Mercy through the days of the petition and the hush of the courthouse call, and she learned that love is a stubborn, messy thing that does not always align with legal counsel. Perkins circulated a petition with more fervor than he had for any town improvement. "A widow cannot raise a child properly," he wrote with a flourish, and passed it around like a talisman. It gathered signatures from those who feared scandal and those who feared the unknown. Ada could see herself in windows as she walked to the well, the silhouette of a woman in a patchwork shawl. She bore their glances like rain, and like rain her shoulders grew used to the weight of that pressure. When Judge Emmett, a man who had inherited his seat by way of connections to the Trainer line, called a hearing, the town turned out as if for an event of consequence. The courtroom smelled faintly of wood and ink and horses, and the benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk who had their own verdicts ready. Ada stood without counsel. She knew mechanically how to answer questions with the kind of plain truth that a hard life breeds. "Where did you find the child?" the judge asked, not unkindly, but with the boredom of one accustomed to matters decided on paper. "At the ruins of Haversham's outbuilding," Ada said. "She was in a basket. I took her in." "And you say the child was abandoned?" "I say I found a baby in the snow and could not leave her." Ada's voice had a steady pitch now. "That's what I did." Mr. Trainer's lawyer presented the letter from Anna, a careful script that told a story of fear and a request that her daughter be kept safe. The legalities fell like stones. "Mr. Trainer is prepared to establish a trust," said the lawyer. "We seek only the child's welfare. If Mrs. Mallory has the child's best interest at heart, she will accept our offer." Ada felt the room tilt with each word. Mercy slept in a corner of the courtroom, wrapped in one of Ruth's blankets, content despite the trial. Someone sobbed quietly, perhaps for Mercy's mother, perhaps for the theater of law, and Ada wondered at the cruelty of arrangements that required displays of defense where simple truth would have sufficed. When the judge adjourned for a break, whispers rose like smoke. "It's about legacy," said Perkins. "Trainer has land, cows that would feed her, schooling the likes of which this town couldn't dream of." There were nods from those who thought in ledgers, but there were also those who remembered the small, practical evidence of Ada's care. The warmth in Mercy's cheeks, the way the child reached for Ada's hair, as if remembering a hand she had known. Ada sat with Ruth in a kitchen across from the courthouse and felt the ache of decision press at her like a familiar weight. Ruth poured coffee without asking and set a cup in Ada's hand. "They have money and lawyers," Ruth said. "You have a child's day-to-day. The law doesn't always know how to prize that." "I don't want to be obstinate," Ada said slowly. "If the child would be safer with better schooling and quarters—" "Safer?" Ruth's voice snapped, but the sharpness was care. "Safer where? With a man who would place his daughter in the road because his pride could not hold? Safer with a family who might buy the right life and forget the living part of it?" Ada clenched the cup until the rim bit her palm. "It's not just pride," she said. "Things are more complicated." So they returned to the courtroom and listened to arguments that prized birth and title. The judge ruled temporary custody to Mr. Traynor, pending a formal hearing scheduled for weeks hence. He balanced the scales in the way of men who fear being overturned by wealth, citing precedents and bloodline, and a worry that the town might be unsettled by a permanent alternative. Ada walked out under the open sky with Mercy in arms, a small comet of life held close enough to warm her face. That night, the sky broke open with a storm that seemed to want to bury the world whole. Winds tugged like hands on shutters. The barn doors rattled like a drum, and the snow fell in curtains that hid the horizon. Traynor's carriage came again to fetch the child. The nurse they had hired, one with the efficient look of a woman schooled in city hospitals, came up the lane with a professional air. Mercy fussed and then screamed when hands reached for her that were unfamiliar. Ada would have handed the child over in the light of law, but Mercy, when taken by the nurse, turned and arched back into Ada's arms, fingers curling like claws at the warmth they had known. The protest was not a child's politeness. It was raw and fierce. Mercy's cry cracked through the snow. The nurse, with her calm veneer, tried to soothe, offered a bottle, but the baby only wanted the something that bound her to the human who had taken the cold and warmed it away for a little while. Traynor watched with a visage that was both surprised and something like grief. He had built his life on order. He had assumed tenderness could be purchased and scheduled. In Mercy's rejection of the formal hand, he saw something he had never allowed himself to witness: the consequence of a life that had chosen its own solidity over the messy business of care. For a long minute he stared at the child and then at Ada, who stood small against the storm. "She needs time to settle," Ada said. "She needs someone to show her that home is not a place you get, it's a place you are." Traynor's jaw loosened. Something in his stance softened like a lock releasing. He could have insisted, used his paper to claim, to order, to demand. Instead, he did something that surprised the town. He asked for shelter. He said quietly that the storm would trap them, and no carriage could travel in such weather without risking life. "We'll stay," he said, with an awkward attempt at tenderness. "For a night. We'll see how she fares." 3 days of storm locked them in the small house like a reluctant congregation. The nurse checked temperature and bandaged a scraped knee Mercy acquired in a nap gone wrong. The lawyer fussed with papers and deemed them useless beside a child who refused to accept suits or ledgers. Traynor sat by the stove and watched Ada move around the room. The familiar rhythms of someone who had learned to keep a house functioning through the long work of small deeds. Dinner was soup that revealed itself to be better for lack of expectation. At night, Traynor rocked the baby awkwardly and learned how to shush. The first time Mercy slept in his arms without fighting, he looked like a man who had seen a small, impossible miracle. When the storm cleared, a subtle change had come. The carriage stood ready, but Traynor did not rush to take Mercy away. He had been in a position of certainty and found it shifting under him. He had seen Ada in the way other men sometimes saw things too late, with clarity and the regret that follows it. He talked haltingly about Anna in a voice that had a crack to it. "She was my daughter," he said once to the room that had turned quiet. "She was headstrong and stubborn, and perhaps I was too proud. I would not enroll any child in my house to be choked by expectations. If she asked for someone to care for Mercy, if she chose, then I owe it to my daughter to heed that choice." The hearing convened with a different air. The town watched, and the judge found himself between law that spoke of blood and a man who had stood to learn what being a grandfather meant in a hurry. Traynor stepped forward, uncharacteristically humble, and withdrew his claim. He established a trust, yes, but more importantly, he asked for mercy for himself, and requested that Ada be recognized as Mercy's guardian. "I will visit," he said, "and I shall pay for schooling and help as he needs, but not to govern, not to rule." The judge, moved perhaps by the sight of a man who had chosen to be better than his history, agreed. When the gavel fell and the town took to the streets again, in an odd mix of gossip and good cheer, Ada found herself outside with Mercy on her hip and Ruth beside her, and a small crowd who had reason to feel they had witnessed a small victory for the humane. Mercy reached up and grabbed at Ada's hair with a grip that was not yet sure but held promise. Ada felt something give in her chest the way a seam opens to let in light. She had been widowed and hollowed, and something that had been empty filled with a careful, improbable warmth. Spring had not yet come, but in the aftermath of snow there were signs. Small, stubborn shoots through the frozen ground, the way the creek found its voice again. Ada walked to the edge of the knoll and set down the basket that had once been Mercy's first bed. She planted a stone there and tucked a scrap of cloth into the weave, a small marker to the random mercy of that night's discovery. She knew the law could change, that life could pull at the seams of what people thought they'd decided. But in Mercy's sleeping face she saw a future that was not hers alone, and yet made her a part of it. There were days of ordinary trials, fevers that took her from sleep, nights spent pacing the floor with a baby who could not be coaxed, neighbors who offered help, and neighbors who measured her worth in what she could not provide. There were also moments of pure recompense. Mercy's first laugh, like a bell in the morning, the way her fingers curled over Ada's thumb as if to anchor herself to the living. Ada found herself reading the old books Daniel had loved, speaking their words in a voice that the child learned to recognize and find comfort in. And in those small, steady acts lay something that had been missing from Ada's life since the funeral. Mercy's presence did not erase grief. It threaded itself through it. Ada woke with new purpose and the kind of fear that belongs to anyone who loves. The knowledge that anything could be taken, and the stubborn decision to keep and protect anyway. The town, too, began to shift in small ways. Perkins, who had once scowled like a man counting losses, was seen bringing wood to the Mallory place on a morning when the stove had broken. Old Harlan lent a hand when Mercy took ill, and his boy, who once had an eye for mischief, learned to make a cradle swing just so. Traynor came sometimes with parcels, then with stories of Anna's childhood, then with a presence that was less about control and more about witness. He would sit awkwardly on the stoop and play with Mercy, while Ada stirred stew, his hands heavy with the habit of management, but growing gentler in small ways. The life that grew around Mercy was not neat. It was threaded with the mess of living. Small betrayals, apologies that arrived late, reconciliations tentative as green shoots. But it was a thing of its own, built by a woman who had learned to be decisive from the sharp edges of loss, and by a town that found in this child's survival the chance to reconfigure its notions of what family could mean. Ada learned, too, that being a guardian was not merely to feed and clothe, but to hold in a way that made a child brave. She taught Mercy to look at the sky and find the stories in cloud and wind. She braided yarn into a sling and carried the child across fields where once she had only walked alone. Mercy grew, and with each small growth came responsibilities, and a strange, fierce joy that made Ada's hands steady even when her heart wanted to run. The stone at the knoll wore the scuffs of seasons. Each time Ada passed, she thought of the woman who had wrapped Mercy and left her in a basket, of the choices that lead people to desperate acts, and of the ugly and the beautiful that can live in the same heart. She would have liked to meet Anna, to ask about the small script that had named Mercy for her, to hear the reasons that led to such a relinquishing. But some questions must live unasked, their edges softened by time and the dignity of absence. In the evenings, Ada would sit by the fire and hum songs she had not sung in years, the lyrics finding new meaning now they served a child's lullaby. Mercy would drift into sleep, and the house would remember its own rhythms, the ones that keep a family coherent through the most ordinary days. Months stitched into each other, and Mercy grew, a child who learned to know the sound of Ada's footsteps before she could speak. When she finally said a word that sounded like "Ma," Ada felt her breath leave her like a prayer. It was not the same as Daniel's voice, nor should it be. It was something that belonged solely to Mercy and to the life they were building in a house that had once been quiet. Outside, the land prepared itself for spring in stubborn, small gestures. Ada walked fields that seemed to whisper of planting and of work to come. Mercy sat in the sun with Ruth and learned the names of birds. Trainer visited and read them stories of a girl who had once run through orchards, and Ada felt that the work of mending a life could be done by more than one pair of hands. One evening, as dusk settled with a soft insistence, a letter arrived with a careful hand. It was brief, the kind of formal apology that men with power sometimes write when their regrets catch up with them. Eli Trainer had come to understand what it meant to choose Mercy before a ledger. He had written then to ask that Ada accept his help not as governance, but as kinship. He sent a small parcel for Mercy. Books, a tin rattle, a shawl with a pattern of blue flowers. There was no fanfare, no public admission that he had been wrong, just a gesture which was more than pride often allows. Ada placed the shawl beside the child's bed and thought of the ways in which small gifts could bridge the past and the future. Mercy slept and the room kept its soft watch. Outside the fields were patient as always, for the land knows how to hold the seasons. Inside, Ada felt the slow stitch of hope knot itself into her days. She had been a widow, and for a time had been content with the measured quiet. But Mercy had come like a crack in the frost that made room for something altogether different. Not erasing grief, but carrying it forward as a part of a life that still had work to do. Ada found herself ready for it, not unafraid, but steady with the knowledge that love, once given, will demand courage in equal measure. And so they moved forward, a woman and a child taking the steps that every family takes. Small rituals, steady hands, and the persistent hope that the world could make room for them both. The knoll remained marked with a stone and a scrap of cloth, a place where the town sometimes left coins and little trinkets, pilgrims paying their quiet respects to a Mercy that had come in the night and decided to stay. The years folded into one another, the way old letters fold in a drawer, creased, softened, and touched by hands that remember too much. Mercy was 6 when the first spring came without frost biting at the edges of the windows. She had a laugh that started small, and then filled every corner of Ada Mallory's house like sunlight finding its way through curtains. The old woman had grown thinner, her hair more gray than gold now, but there was a steadiness to her that people noticed even when they pretended not to. The Mallory farm had changed too. What used to be a place of silence was now full of small things. Little dresses hanging by the stove, shoes drying by the hearth, drawings tacked to the wall with bits of wire. Mercy had a habit of leaving ribbons on everything she loved. Ada's broom handle, the bedpost, even the weathered cross that marked Daniel's grave. The child's touch had turned grief into something gentler, something that could be carried without bleeding. Ruth came by most evenings, still running the boarding house but finding excuses to stop. Sometimes she brought biscuits, sometimes she brought laughter. She'd sit by the fire, Mercy asleep in her lap, and say things like, "That child's going to be a wildflower in this world, too stubborn to die, too bright to ignore." Ada would smile and pretend she didn't hear the undertone of affection in Ruth's words. For her, not the child. Eli Trainer visited every few months. The once proud man came without lawyers now, only with books or bolts of fabric for Mercy's dresses. He had grown slower, his hair white as early snow. He'd sit on the porch, Mercy climbing onto his knee to show him whatever new wonder she had discovered that week. A shiny rock, a frog that lived behind the trough, a ribbon tied into a perfect knot. Trainer would listen, nodding as though each revelation deserved a ledger of its own. He had become something quieter than a patriarch, something humbler than a king. But peace is a thin fabric in the territories. The world beyond the fences still traded in storms. The new railroad line had been creeping west for 2 summers now, and with it came men with more ambition than sense. They brought cards and whiskey and promises that didn't hold up to daylight. Ada didn't pay them much mind. Until the day a man named Silas Boone rode into town with papers in his satchel and a smirk too sharp for a friendly smile. He was a surveyor, or claimed to be, wore a coat cleaner than a working man's, and boots too polished for the dust they walked on. He asked questions in that smooth way city men did when they already knew the answers, about land rights, about Trainer's holdings, about who owned the stretch by Bennett Creek, land that brushed against Ada's small plot. Boone stayed at Ruth's boarding house, tipping his hat with the kind of politeness that made people forget to watch his hands. He talked about opportunity, about how the railroad would make the town rich. But in the corners of his talk were whispers of buying, of selling, of moving fences where they didn't belong. When word spread that the rail company planned to seize unused property, Ada's name found its way into ledgers she had never signed. "A widow living on inherited land," Boone said one afternoon at the general store, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Might be best for her to take compensation before the company decides to take it proper." Ada stood in the doorway, Mercy holding her hand. She didn't raise her voice. This land was Daniel Mallory's, and before him, his father's. It's been worked, sown, and buried on. If your company wants it, they'll need to dig up our ghosts first. Boone smiled like someone who had already won. "Ma'am, ghosts don't stand up in court." Ruth stepped between them then, her tone all steel. "Neither do liars, Mr. Boone. Careful where you point your papers." The man tipped his hat and left, but his grin lingered in the air like gun smoke. For weeks afterward, strange men rode the boundary at dusk, measuring, muttering, marking with stakes. Ada sent Mercy inside whenever she saw them. But children have a way of wandering where they shouldn't, and one afternoon, Mercy followed a robin through the field, all the way to the fence line where one of Boone's men was hammering in a post. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice soft but fearless. The man turned. "Making room for the new track, little miss. Gotta move this fence back a piece." "This is our land," she said simply. "You can't move it." He laughed and kept hammering. That was when Ada's voice carried across the field, low and steady, like a storm building behind clouds. "Touch that fence again and you'll lose the hand you used to do it." The man turned, half a smirk still on his lips, until he saw the shotgun in Ada's arms. Her stance wasn't bluff. She was a ranch woman, and the way she held the weapon told the truth. The man dropped the hammer, muttered a curse, and backed off. That night, Boone came himself. Brought whiskey and charm like a snake dressed for Sunday. He said it was all misunderstanding, that the company was willing to pay fair coin. Ada didn't offer him a chair. She stood in the doorway with the lantern behind her, casting her shadow long and dark across the yard. "You can't buy what you didn't plant," she said. Boone's smile faltered. "Everything's for sale, Mrs. Mallory. You just have to know what price a person fears most." When he left, Ada locked the door and stood there for a long time, listening to the wind like it might carry an answer. Mercy stirred in her sleep, mumbling words Ada couldn't make out. Ruth arrived minutes later, breathless from running. "Boone's stirring trouble," she said. "He's claiming your land was never properly deeded. Says the railroad will claim it by spring." Ada sat at the table, rubbing her temples. "Let them come," she murmured. "We'll see how far paper gets them in a storm." But storms have a way of coming sooner than expected. A month later, word spread that Trainer was dying. His heart, they said, had finally given out after too many winters. Ada and Mercy rode into town to see him. He looked small in his bed, the mighty Eli Trainer now pale as the sheets that held him. Mercy climbed up beside him, fearless as always, and took his hand. He smiled at that, really smiled, and whispered, "You remind me of your mother." He turned his eyes to Ada. "The company's after your land," he rasped. "Boone. He's got friends in Helena. Promised the rail line to cut through your field. But that land, it's got oil, small pocket. That's what he's after. There's a deed in my safe at the bank. My lawyer knows where. It names you, Ada. All that land, mine, yours, it's to be held for her." Ada felt her throat close. Eli, why me? Because you loved her when she had nothing left. I couldn't do that for Anna. Don't let men like me take her second chance away. He passed before morning. When Ada left the room, Mercy pressed her face into Ada's coat and whispered, Grandpa's gone, isn't he? Ada nodded. Yes, love, but he left you something that men like Boone can't buy. 2 weeks later, the bank fire destroyed half the documents in the vault, including the deed Traynor had mentioned. Boone moved fast. He arrived with a sheriff from another county, papers signed by men who'd never seen the land. He gave Ada 3 days to vacate before the railroad crew came through. Those 3 days became a crucible. The town whispered, some offering pity, others distance. Ruth stood with Ada, fierce as ever. You can fight this, she said. With what? Ada asked. Law burns as easy as paper. With people, Ruth answered. So Ruth gathered the townsfolk who owed Ada more than they'd ever admit. The ones she'd helped through sickness, through harvest, through winters when bread was thin. They came with pitchforks and prayers and the kind of loyalty born of quiet gratitude. On the morning the railroad crew arrived, the town was waiting. Ada stood at the edge of her field, Mercy beside her, Ruth and a dozen others forming a line behind. Boone rode up with a smirk and a warrant in hand. You'll move, he said. No, Ada answered simply. Boone's men looked uncertain. They were used to taking, not being told no by women and farmers with spades. Boone laughed once sharply. You're making a mistake, ma'am. Ada raised her chin. Maybe, but it's mine to make. Behind her the townsfolk murmured. Then, slowly, one by one, they stepped forward, forming a wall. The sheriff hesitated. He knew a mob when he saw one, and this one wasn't leaving. Boone cursed under his breath, his plans unraveling. He turned his horse and spat into the snow. You'll regret this, he said. Maybe, Ada replied again. But I'll do it on my land. It wasn't the law that saved her. It was winter itself. That night, a blizzard swept through, the kind that closes roads and buries ambition. Boone's camp was destroyed, his papers scattered. By morning, the railroad foreman had pulled the crew 2 towns east. Boone left without a word. Some said he went bankrupt. Others swore they saw him years later, working as a clerk somewhere far from the frontier. When spring came again, the fields bloomed. Ada rebuilt the fence by hand. Ruth came every evening, laughter like music in the fading light. Mercy ran through the grass barefoot, ribbons flying. Eli Traynor's lawyer arrived months later with a parcel. The deed had been duplicated, kept safe elsewhere. The land was theirs by right, sealed in Mercy's name. Ada read the words by lantern light, tears blurring the ink. Mercy asked, What does it mean, Ma? Ada smiled. It means this place is ours, and no one can take that away now. The seasons turned gently after that. Mercy grew tall, bold, and unafraid of storms. Ruth and Ada grew older together, 2 women who had built a life from ashes and faith. Sometimes, when the sun dipped behind the ridge, Ada would whisper to the air, as if Daniel or Anna or Eli might still be listening. Guess you're my family now. All of you, Mercy's laughter would answer, carried by the wind, bright and alive. And somewhere beyond the hill, the last remnants of the old rail stakes rusted quietly, buried beneath wildflowers that refused to die.